Hey everybody, hope you're having a great week. Today we're talking about framing, which is the third of the three media effects that we've been talking about in the course. And of course, in previous weeks we've spoken about priming and agenda setting as two fundamental media effects models, and framing is certainly no different in its importance, especially in the modern literature of media effects. Essentially, with these three conceptual frameworks together, we have a really good understanding now of how it is that media might actually have an impact on the way that Americans think and feel about the stories of the day. And so I think when we've been consulting the reading about priming and the reading about agenda setting, we've really been focusing on the subconscious effects of those two media effects, and not so much on the overt nature of those effects. So we talked about agenda setting as being a potentially inescapable form of media behavior, where journalists are trying to select stories, and that story selection process is resulting in major agenda setting patterns, whether journalists like it or not. We talked about priming and how repetitive mention of various idea elements or topics or sort of pieces of content might also have an indirect effect of sticking in the heads of the people who are receiving those messages through a subconscious process. But framing is really, I think, more overt in a couple of different ways. And it comes in largely this more overt nature in the fact that framing can be defined maybe as taking a perspective to bring some aspects of a situation in close focus relative to others. So this is much more about how journalists themselves might choose to emphasize different aspects of a story, might choose to put the focus on different idea elements within a broader framework of a topic, and in doing so can greatly persuade audiences to think about a topic in a specific way. So framing, which is occasionally called second-order agenda setting. It has other names, and the literature has debated ad nauseum whether framing is distinct from these other media effects. If we were to take this as a distinct media effect, I think the most distinct, or the nature of its distinction from these other effects is about the relative importance of idea elements within a broader topic. So let's think a little bit about how that might work. So when we think about topic selection, I think a really good example of framing over the past couple of decades is the topic of immigration. Now, if I were engaging in agenda setting, or what we might call otherwise first-order agenda setting, then we could think about whether or not journalists choose to focus on immigration at any given time. And certainly over the past few years, even in the present moment, we've had criticism of media where some people on maybe one side of the political spectrum have said media isn't focusing enough on immigration. Other people in the media sphere would say people are focusing too much on immigration and they're making this out to be a bigger problem than it is. And so there's a debate actively, I think, about how much attention the immigration question deserves as part of the national media agenda. But within that, if we were to assume that that agenda setting has occurred and media sources are choosing at any given moment to discuss immigration, we could think about there's a variety of ways that we could talk about this. There is a variety of sort of devices, linguistic and otherwise, to describe what's actually going on. And so one way that we could think about that choice, or that set of choices, is this idea of issue dimensions or angles or sort of sides of the issue that we could highlight. So if you think about it, you could pause the slide and maybe think about this. What are some different angles or dimensions of this issue that would be useful to highlight? And so you might think, certainly there's been a lot of rhetoric recently surrounding immigration in terms of economic migration, where people are coming. Certainly in 2018, during the midterm elections, we saw a lot of narratives surrounding the idea of this caravan. If you may remember the caravan moment, which was a real flash in the pan in terms of media attention, especially on the right-wing side, seemed to coincide very clearly with the election. there was this concern about caravans of migrants, and it seemed that they were coming to the United States not really to seek asylum, but to sort of claim jobs and take resources away from other Americans. And so if we compare that kind of economic migrant angle to maybe stories from the 1980s or earlier, a lot of stories about immigration to the United States were framed on the basis of valid asylum claims. And so we think about, for example, in the wake of the Vietnam War, a lot of the immigration, coverage was about Hmong immigrants, for example, coming from Vietnam and resettling, about other war-torn countries all across the world, and America welcoming some of those refugees. And so we've got very different kinds of idea elements that are invoked when we think about either immigration from an economic perspective, right? Are people coming here to claim jobs, or from an asylum perspective, are people coming here to flee, violence or sort of political persecution in their own countries? And so you can imagine if you were to emphasize, like, oh, these are asylum seekers, or oh, these are economic migrants, this frame or this choice of how to characterize migrants could really change the way that the public thinks about those people, about their perceptions of deservingness, about their perceptions of legality in big air quotes, right? Whatever that means to be a legal entity. It's a very challenging, I think, thing to contend with for both media sources and for us as consumers of media to think about. Hey, I mean, this is a very, very important issue, and obviously it's of utmost importance for the people who are actually coming to seek asylum in the United States, because these are their lives on the line, ultimately. These kinds of narratives, though, can really influence public opinion about them, and ultimately, if we imagine that government is listening to the public, it could shape also policies that could eventually impact the way that these people experience their asylum claim. So framing is really important. Framing is incredibly valuable in terms of a concept for understanding how it is that Americans form and shape their public perceptions. But if we think about these different dimensions, these different sort of concept dimensions, there's a lot of different types of frames that scholars have written about in the past that I think are useful for learning about in this week's stuff. So, for instance, we could talk about an incident frame or a substance frame, which is essentially if an event or a development or a news story breaks, a substance frame would say, let's talk about what happened or what are the details of a problem or a development. So an example that I could go back to is, in Baltimore recently, a couple of times there have been explosions that have certainly attracted national headlines. I know, for example, my mom called me, when one of these explosions happened in a house somewhere in northeast Baltimore. It was northwest Baltimore, and she called me and she said, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, what's going on?" She's like, "There was an explosion." I was like, "Okay, I didn't even know about this. I don't live in that neighborhood. This is miles away from me." She was very concerned because this was like breaking news on CNN, like the ticker was scrolling. Obviously, we can think about some of those media values, remember, from previous weeks, and think about why national cable news would be so fixated on an explosion in a residential area of one city in the country. But again, if we think about these explosions as being a topic for discussion of any given day, maybe CNN, maybe WJZ, or maybe the Baltimore Sun choose to highlight this in their coverage for very easily explained reasons. An incident frame or a substance frame would just simply be filling that reporting with what happened. Right? What happened? Where was this? Who was affected? Were there any injuries? What was the age of the house? Was this house regularly serviced by BGE? How did this work? However, we can think about, alternatively, a policy frame, which could be a very different conversation indeed about this topic, which would just say, how could this possibly happen? How is it that in 2021, in a residential area in the state of Maryland, a house can just explode with no warning? Shouldn't there be some kind of better check on these gas lines? Shouldn't we have a policy in place that would help prevent explosions like this in the future? And so this is focusing on laws and regulations. And you can really think about the contrast here. You could, as a journalist, consider writing a report, writing an article here that could either emphasize, here's just what happened, and this was an isolated incident, and it had to do with this place, and we talked to 3 of the residents who were shocked. Or you can make this much more political in your coverage through the inclusion of a policy frame. So again, this is really showing this idea that frames matter, because in the latter case, if you're really using a policy frame to talk about this could change the public discourse, where residents of Baltimore could, go to the city council and say, why are our houses exploding? We need to fix this problem. We need to have an audit of all the gas lines in the city. We need to spend money on this and try to make sure that people are made more safe. Whereas in the incident frame, somebody would say, oh, those poor people, I guess this is a one-off, random things happen, right? And not connect this explicitly in their mind to policy unless they had some kind of political sophistication. So again, this is about leading public opinion through emphasizing different story details. A process frame could be, I guess we could continue to apply this to this random story that I was just thinking about. A process frame is more about the how behind a development. So you could imagine a process frame in terms of this explosion story being like, so how does BGE get gas into your house? How do they ensure that it's safe? What is the process, right? What are the steps that are usually taken to avoid this? Are there routine checks? Does gas leak reporting happen effectively? Do they vent it in time, right? What are the statistics on the timeliness of BGE's responses? Process frames could be really important here. And then finally, right, you could think about strategy or conflict frames, which could even, again, this is maybe more far-fetched. Obviously, these are usually used in more political kinds of discussions rather than this one-off house explosion. But if the house exploded, you could also consider a strategy frame here where you might say, what does this mean for the mayor, right? Does this look bad for him? Like, is Mayor Scott going to be able to respond in time? Like, what would his critics say about the failing infrastructure in our city? And so that kind of thing would emphasize essentially who stands to win and who stands to lose from this happening from a broader political perspective. So we think about like the substance, policy, process, strategy, all these different frames. Again, the topic is the same. The agenda has been set. We're talking about this one story, but how we talk about it is up to journalists. And pivotally, this could influence, in this case, attributions of responsibility, which means who's responsible ultimately for this crisis. The buck stops with someone is the idea. And so we as journalists, we can choose essentially with a strategy or a conflict frame to emphasize a political actor or de-emphasize a political actor with a process frame or with some kind of just basic substance frame. So these are really, I think, important, valuable distinctions. And again, as I've just mentioned, I think a really important political dimension of framing is about who claims credit and who gets blame. So when we go back to framing as a concept, we've been thinking about, a media case of this house explosion, this terrible, this tragedy that's happened. But when it comes down to it, it's not just media reporters who are seeking to explain what's happening. This constructed explanation is also something that politicians have a really, really, really strong, set of interests in trying to craft. So politicians are always trying to claim credit for good things and deflect blame for bad things. And so this is why framing is a very competitive process in today's media environment. You've got both political and non-political actors. You've got more sort of mainstream journalists, you've got local journalists, and then you've got more sort of partisan aligned journalists also in the media ecosystem, constantly trying to construct frames that are going to, again, make the in party or whoever is the preferred party look good, make the out party, whoever is not preferred, look bad. And so this is where a lot of the contentiousness in political media come in. This is really the place where we start to get really into the nasty stuff, right? Where people are starting to make baseless accusations and are starting to sort of go become junkyard dogs without much justification, right? Following potential scandals to the ends of the earth for motivated reasons. All kinds of intense sort of partisan behavior can be boiled down to framing efforts to assign credit and blame for political developments. However, I think it's important to consider that it's not always the case that framing, that is, creating an explanation, is in some cases almost out of thin air, on the basis of policy, on the basis of substance, on the basis of, pithy, kind of memorable idea elements that people are going to associate with stories. And maybe the case that sometimes framing is difficult. And by that I mean, it might be hard to introduce an idea element that is different than what's been discussed so far. So again, if you think about it, right, like with this house explosion thing, if I wanted to make some sort of case that I don't know, that like the city schools superintendent was responsible for this explosion, right? That's like an incredibly far bridge to cross, right? That's like a really strange assertion, and something that would cause people to really just scratch their heads and say, "What's your deal? What's your angle here? Why are you trying to make this assertion?" That just doesn't seem to make sense. It's a stretch. And so we can imagine that for some kinds of political issues, the attribution of responsibility, the credit, and the blame, it's really plainly obvious who's responsible, right? And so efforts to shift that blame or to reorient sometimes become really, really difficult. However, we can imagine the communications entrepreneurs, or that is, partisan communicators, are always seeking ways to be more and more creative with ways to deflect blame and to take credit. So certainly, we've seen examples in recent years, and I leave it to you to maybe think of some salient ones where political leaders have claimed credit for things that they had absolutely no part in creating, and also deflected blame for things that were very squarely their fault. And it seems very curious, but it seems that kind of mode of political communication is increasingly just, deny, deny, deny. Flood the zone actually is a term that's being used more and more to describe this, where you might also just seek to reframe the agenda by just talking about completely different topics if framing is too difficult. So framing is not always perfectly effective, but nevertheless, we can see that whenever ambiguity comes into play, emphasizing certain story elements can have a political consequence, almost always. So I want to also mention that some things are going to be more easy to frame than others. And so we could think about, for example, framing is going to be especially easy when we have access to the original sources of information. So especially political figureheads, incumbents who are actually in the room, they actually do have an easier job of framing certain developments when they were responsible for crafting some of these policies, right? If framing boils down to a he said, she said, if you're somebody who's directly responsible for something, then it's easier to have some kind of control over the flow of information. And I think one real benefit, perhaps, of journalists who are engaged in very sort of close investigative reporting, journalists who are going down to City Hall, physically showing up at various meetings, various public hearings, and asking questions and taking notes. I think there's a real premium to this, specifically because that allows you to have a jump on this framing effort. Going back to the libertarian model of journalism, which I think we've more and more over the semester come to believe has a pretty important thing to say about our modern journalistic environment, I think we can see that there's also a profit motive to this as well, right? Framing a story, constructing a certain angle means that you can get more clicks and you can get more attention. And so getting close to the story is not the only way to engage in sort of cheap framing, but this is, I think, a really, really good example of how journalists who are close to a story, who are able to actually be there, get a head start on determining what idea elements are most important in the story. And so we hope that those journalists are doing their jobs effectively and are really thinking carefully about what's most relevant and most useful for the public to consume from a social responsibility perspective. That's, I think, a really important thing. And again, going back to the question of democracy and whether or not this institution is serving the public, that is an open question that we'll be discussing in just a little while. So I want to just close by getting you to start thinking about this. We're going to talk more about this in detail during our class, but I want to really think about the idea that we've got these three media effects. We've got priming, again, this automatic, instantaneous process of repetition. We've got framing now, this idea that journalists and other actors in the media environment are responsible for highlighting different story elements and maybe paying diminished attention to others in an effort, sometimes explicit, to make them look good and make others look bad. Then we've got agenda setting, that sort of primary order story selection kind of behavior, which really does determine what the public talks about at any given moment. I want to ask you, given that we've got these three models that we've been talking about, which do you think are the most powerful models? Which do you think are the least powerful models? And also, in what ways may these effects be potentially overlapping? Either similar in terms of their theoretical assumptions, overlapping in terms of their effects. Can we really disentangle these three things, or are they really all sort of the same phenomenon, just broken down into three constituent parts? So think carefully about those questions, and when we meet, we'll talk a little bit about Ball-Rokeach and Defleur's article, which I think is a really, really important one, and then, of course, the slightly more recent examination of framing as well. And so I really look forward to that discussion. I hope you have a great week, and I will talk to you soon.